Chapter 8 Part B. That Mr. Franklin was in love, on his side, nobody who saw and heard him could doubt. The difficulty was to fathom Miss Rachel. Let me do myself the honor of making you acquainted with her, after which, I will leave you to fathom for yourself, if you can. My young lady's 18th birthday was the birthday now coming, on the 21st of June. If you happen to like dark women, who, I am informed, have gone out of fashion latterly in the gay world, and if you have no particular prejudice in favor of size, I answer for Miss Rachel as one of the prettiest girls your eyes ever looked on. She was small and slim, but all in fine proportion from top to toe. To see her sit down, to see her get up, and specially to see her walk, was enough to satisfy any man in his senses that the graces of her figure, if you will pardon me the expression, were in her flesh and not in her clothes. Her hair was the blackest I ever saw. Her eyes matched her hair. Her nose was not quite large enough, I admit. Her mouth and chin were, to quote Mr. Franklin, morsels for the gods, and her complexion, on the same undeniable authority, was as warm as the sun itself, with this great advantage over the sun, that it was always in nice order to look at. Add to the foregoing that she carried her head as upright as a dart, in a dashing, spirited, thoroughbred way, that she had a clear voice, with a ring of the right metal in it, and a smile that began very prettily in her eyes before it got to her lips, and there behold the portrait of her, to the best of my painting, as large as life. And what about her disposition next? Had this charming creature no faults? She had just as many faults as you have, ma'am, neither more nor less. To put it seriously, my dear pretty Miss Rachel, possessing a host of graces and attractions, had one defect, which strict impartiality compels me to acknowledge. She was unlike most other girls of her age, in this that she had ideas of her own, and was stiff-necked enough to set the fashions themselves at defiance, if the fashions didn't suit her views. In trifles, this independence of hers was all well enough, but in matters of importance, it carried her, as my lady thought, and as I thought, too far. She judged for herself, as few women of twice her age judge in general, never asked your advice, never told you beforehand what she was going to do, never came with secrets and confidences to anybody, from her mother downwards. In little things and great, with people she loved, and people she hated, and she did both with equal heartiness, Miss Rachel always went on a way of her own, sufficient for herself in the joys and sorrows of her life. Over and over again I have heard my lady say, Rachel's best friend and Rachel's worst enemy are, one and the other, Rachel herself. Add one thing more to this, and I have done. With all her secrecy, and self-will, there was not so much as the shadow of anything false in her. I never remember her breaking her word, I never remember her saying no, and meaning yes. I can call to mind, in her childhood, more than one occasion when the good little soul took the blame, and suffered the punishment, for some fault committed by a playfellow whom she loved. Nobody ever knew her to confess to it, when the thing was found out, and she was charged with it afterwards. But nobody ever knew her to lie about it, either. She looked you straight in the face, and shook her little saucy head, and said plainly, I won't tell you. Punished again for this, she would own to being sorry for saying, won't, but, bread and water notwithstanding, she never told you. Self-willed, devilish self-willed sometimes, I grant, but the finest creature, nevertheless, that ever walked the ways of this lower world. Perhaps you think you see a certain contradiction here? In that case, a word in your ear. Study your wife closely, for the next 24 hours. If your good lady doesn't exhibit something in the shape of a contradiction in that time, heaven help you, you have married a monster. I have now brought you acquainted with Miss Rachel, which you will find puts us face to face, next, with the question of that young lady's matrimonial views. On June the 12th, an invitation from my mistress was sent to a gentleman in London, to come and help to keep Miss Rachel's birthday. This was the fortunate individual on whom I believed her heart to be privately set. Like Mr. Franklin, he was a cousin of hers. His name was Mr. Godfrey Abel White. My lady's second sister, don't be alarmed, We are not going very deep into family matters this time. My lady's second sister, I say, had a disappointment in love, and taking a husband afterwards, on the neck-or-nothing principle, made what they call a misalliance. There was terrible work in the family when the Honorable Caroline insisted on marrying plain Mr. Abel White, the banker at Frising Hall. He was very rich and very respectable, and he begot a prodigious large family, all in his favor, so far. But he had presumed to raise himself from a low station in the world, and that was against him. However, time and the progress of modern enlightenment put things right, and the misalliance passed muster very well. We are all getting liberal now, and, provided you can scratch me, if I scratch you, what do I care, in or out of Parliament, whether you are a dustman or a duke? That's the modern way of looking at it, and I keep up with the modern way. The Abel Whites lived in a fine house and grounds, a little out of Frising Hall. Very worthy people, and greatly respected in the neighborhood. We shall not be much troubled with them in these pages, excepting Mr. Godfrey, who was Mr. Abel White's second son, and who must take his proper place here, if you please, for Miss Rachel's sake. With all his brightness and cleverness and general good qualities, Mr. Franklin's chance of topping Mr. Godfrey in our young lady's estimation was, in my opinion, a very poor chance indeed. In the first place, Mr. Godfrey was, in point of size, the finest man by far of the two. He stood over 6 feet high, he had a beautiful red and white color, a smooth round face, shaved as bare as your hand, and a head of lovely long flaxen hair, falling negligently over the pole of his neck. But why do I try to give you this personal description of him? If you ever subscribed to a ladies' charity in London, you know Mr. Godfrey Abel White as well as I do. He was a barrister by profession, a ladies' man by temperament, and a good Samaritan by choice. Female benevolence and female destitution could do nothing without him. Maternal societies for confining poor women, Magdalen societies for rescuing poor women, strong-minded societies for putting poor women into poor men's places, and leaving the men to shift for themselves. He was vice-president, manager, referee to them all. Wherever there was a table with a committee of ladies sitting round it in council, there was Mr. Godfrey at the bottom of the board, keeping the temper of the committee, and leading the dear creatures along the thorny ways of business, hat in hand. I do suppose this was the most accomplished philanthropist, on a small independence, that England ever produced. As a speaker at charitable meetings, the like of him for drawing your tears and your money was not easy to find. He was quite a public character. The last time I was in London, my mistress gave me 2 treats. She sent me to the theatre to see a dancing woman who was all the rage, and she sent me to Exeter Hall to hear Mr. Godfrey. The lady did it, with a band of music. The gentleman did it, with a handkerchief and a glass of water. Crowds at the performance with the legs. Ditto at the performance with the tongue. And with all this, the sweetest-tempered person, I allude to Mr. Godfrey, the simplest and pleasantest and easiest to please, you ever met with. He loved everybody. And everybody loved him. What chance had Mr. Franklin, what chance had anybody of average reputation and capacities, against such a man as this? On the 14th, came Mr. Godfrey's answer,